What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Thursday's Theology. I'm Pastor Jeff. This week, we are going to be talking about the Avengers Age of Ultron. Before we begin, I have to confess something. There's a part of this movie that I cannot take seriously no matter how hard I try. This is my confession. Every single time I hear Ultron speak, all I can hear is Robert California from The Office. I am a huge fan of The Office, and whenever I hear Ultron speak, all I can do is think about Robert California and how incredibly, painfully awkward he is. That is the burden I must bear whenever I watch this movie. Anyway, my confession aside, this movie is really, really good. Personally, I prefer the first Avengers movie, but Age of Ultron is a fantastic movie regardless. As for the theology that we're going to be focusing on in this week's episode, I want to focus specifically on the idea of what happens when we take justice into our own hands and not allow God to be the divine judge that Scripture says he is. Ultron represents what happens when we allow our twisted sense of human justice to go unchecked. And that is what we're going to be focusing on for this week's episode. Once again, I'm Pastor Jeff. Let's dive in. What happens when we take divine justice into our own hands? Nothing good, I can promise you that. This idea of taking divine justice into our own hands is pretty evident throughout the Age of Ultron movie. We see that Ultron is supposed to be the ultimate embodiment of justice. In fact, Tony Stark is adamant about creating a peacekeeping system that will protect the world from extraterrestrial attacks. Now, the attack on New York in the first Avengers movie left Tony Stark so rattled that he insisted on creating a system that would protect the world. The Ultron system was designed to be a peacekeeper that would seek out threats and eliminate them. But, as you can see, Ultron ends up becoming a self-aware piece of artificial intelligence. What happens next is that Ultron ends up discerning for itself that humanity, and the Avengers in particular, are the real threats to Earth. Now, I know I covered a lot of the movie in just a few short sentences, but the point of recapping it is to illustrate what happens when we attempt to create systems of justice for ourselves and completely disregard God's role as divine judge. Now, I want to pause and say that I do believe that the legal systems that we create are an attempt to keep injustice at bay and hold perpetrators accountable. The point of this video is not to say that our justice system is useless, rather it is to highlight that there are matters of divine justice that I think we are incapable of administering. For instance, I would like to assume that most of us would agree that human trafficking and exploitation is evil and should have no place in our world. We have some tools in place to make sure that human traffickers are brought to justice, but those systems are ineffective at getting to the root of the issue. One of the authors I really respect is a pastor named Josh Ryan Butler. In his book, The Skeletons in God's Closet, he talks a little bit about the flaw in how we view our own justice system. Human trafficking is an example he uses to point out the fact that we can see how evil the act of trafficking is, and we cry out to God about fixing it. But, as Josh Butler says, the problem with crying out to God about fixing the issue of human trafficking is that we are short-sighted and only want the symptom fixed, not the disease. So in other words, God agrees with us that human trafficking is evil, but God is also concerned with the lust within ourselves that drives the market for human trafficking in the first place. All that to say, I think our justice systems are good, but they cannot get to the root of what drives the evil. So how this is played out in Ultron is that his primary directive is to seek out potential threats and protect the world from them. Over the course of Ultron's self-awareness, it decides that the Avengers are one of those threats to Earth. Now, you see, Tony Stark had created something to objectively search for and neutralize threats. But what Iron Man had not anticipated is that Ultron would ultimately view humanity and the Avengers as the true threat. This is part of the point, I think, of what Josh Butler is making in talking about the justice systems. We want peace and security, and we are willing to set up systems to try and ensure it. But those systems only deal with the symptom, not the disease. Again, I want to make sure to say that I believe we need justice systems in place to hold people accountable. The point I'm trying to make for this video is that any human-made justice system is incomplete. That is why we need to place our hope in God's promise that one day all injustice, all evil, and all sin will be dealt with. We need justice systems, but true justice can only happen when God finally enacts divine justice. Ultron shows us what happens when we try to set up our own justice systems and try to have objective justice. What happens under human justice ultimately is that we discover that we are all guilty. So whenever we set up our own systems of human justice, we also have to hold ourselves to that same standard. So ultimately, it leads us to believe and leads us to understand that we are all culpable in some of the downfalls and sinfulness and brokenness of humanity. So that is where I see the theology of divine justice and human justice wrapped up in the movie of Age of Ultron. And there you have it. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. If you want your weekly dose of theology, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you want to catch up on last week's episode, go ahead and hit the button on the screen to watch that. Otherwise, if you want more information about theology in general, head on over to thursdaystheology.com for more. As always, I'm Pastor Jeff. Thanks for joining me as we explore who God is, what theology is, and why it all matters. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.